Every second, nuclear power plants around the world generate electricity that keeps hospitals running, factories operating, and millions of homes lit through the night. But hidden behind that clean electricity is something almost nobody talks about. Every reactor also produces nuclear waste material so radioactive that some of it must be safely managed for thousands of years. Now here's the question almost nobody asks. Once that fuel is removed from a reactor, who takes responsibility for it? Who builds the facilities, designs the storage systems, provides the security, and gets paid to protect one of the most dangerous materials ever created by mankind? Believe it or not, the answer isn't just governments. It's also a highly specialized industry worth billions of dollars, built on engineering, infrastructure, and long-term contracts. So, you want to own a nuclear waste site? At first, that sounds like the worst business idea imaginable. Why would anyone voluntarily choose to store radioactive material? It's dangerous, heavily regulated, incredibly expensive, and almost impossible to explain to your neighbors. Yet that's exactly why this industry exists. Nuclear waste isn't something society can simply throw away. Unlike ordinary garbage, it can't be buried in a landfill or burned in an incinerator. It must be contained, monitored, transported, and protected using some of the most advanced engineering systems ever developed. Every nuclear power plant eventually faces the same unavoidable problem. The electricity may be sold today, but the waste must be managed for decades, and in some cases, far longer. That creates a business unlike almost any other in the world. Now think about what that really means. As countries search for reliable, low-carbon energy, many continue to invest in nuclear power. More electricity generation means more spent nuclear fuel. More spent fuel means more storage, transportation, monitoring, security, and engineering services. In other words, every new nuclear reactor doesn't just create electricity, it also creates long-term demand for an entire industry that most people never see. While headlines focus on reactors and power generation, a quiet network of engineers, manufacturers, logistics companies, and infrastructure specialists works behind the scenes to solve one of the most difficult problems in modern energy. And that's what makes this business so fascinating. The real money isn't made by producing nuclear power alone. It's made by managing what comes after. But before you can understand why governments spend billions of dollars on this industry, you first need to understand where nuclear waste actually comes from, and why it remains dangerous long after the electricity has already been sold. All begins inside a nuclear reactor. At the heart of every reactor are fuel rods filled with small uranium fuel pellets. These pellets produce enormous amounts of heat through nuclear fission, and that heat is used to create steam that spins turbines and generates electricity. The process is incredibly efficient. In fact, a small amount of uranium can produce far more energy than the same amount of coal or natural gas. But after several years inside the reactor, those fuel rods gradually lose their efficiency. They can no longer sustain power generation at the level the plant requires. That's when they're removed and replaced, not because they've become harmless, but because they've become spent nuclear fuel, one of the most carefully managed materials on Earth. Here's the surprising part. Even after they're removed from the reactor, these fuel assemblies continue producing intense heat and radiation. They can't simply be loaded onto a truck and driven away. Instead, they're first placed in deep cooling pools located at the nuclear power plant itself, where water performs two critical jobs. It removes heat and acts as a radiation shield. The spent fuel typically remains in these pools for several years before it's cool enough to be transferred into massive dry storage casks made from thick steel and reinforced concrete. Each cask is engineered to withstand extreme weather, earthquakes, impacts, and decades of outdoor storage. What looks like an ordinary metal container is actually one of the most sophisticated pieces of engineering in the energy industry. And that's where the business truly begins. Every stage of this process requires highly specialized companies, certified equipment, trained engineers, security personnel, transportation experts, inspectors, and long-term maintenance. Nuclear utilities don't simply buy a storage container and walk away. They pay for decades of engineering, licensing, monitoring, and regulatory compliance. In other words, the product isn't just a steel cask. The product is trust. Trust that the waste will remain safely contained for years, decades, and in some cases even longer. That's why companies operating in this industry aren't selling ordinary industrial equipment. They're selling safety, reliability, and long-term infrastructure, backed by some of the strictest regulations in the world. But storing nuclear waste at a power plant was never meant to be the final solution. So where is all of this radioactive material ultimately supposed to go? And why has finding that answer become one of the biggest engineering and political challenges of the modern era? The truth is, there isn't a single answer that every country follows. Most spent nuclear fuel begins its journey in cooling pools, then moves into dry cask storage at the power plant. These massive steel and concrete containers are designed to safely isolate radioactive material for decades, while governments work toward permanent disposal solutions. But these casks were never intended to be the final destination. They're more like a secure parking garage than a permanent home. The real goal has always been something much more ambitious: deep geological repositories. Underground facilities engineered to isolate nuclear waste far below the Earth's surface for extraordinarily long periods of time. Building one of these repositories is unlike constructing an airport, a dam, or a skyscraper. Scientists spend years studying rock formations, groundwater movement, earthquake risks, and long-term geological stability before a single tunnel is excavated. The facility must remain secure not just for decades, but for timescales far beyond the lifespan of modern civilizations. One of the world's most advanced examples is Finland's Onkalo repository, a deep underground facility designed to permanently dispose of spent nuclear fuel in stable bedrock. Meanwhile, the United States has spent decades debating Yucca Mountain in Nevada, a proposed repository that became one of the most controversial infrastructure projects in American history. Billions of dollars have been invested in research, engineering, and planning, yet political disagreement has prevented it from becoming an operating disposal site. That alone shows how this industry isn't driven only by engineering. It is also shaped by politics, public opinion, and national policy. And that's exactly why this business has such enormous barriers to entry. Companies working in nuclear waste management aren't simply pouring concrete or manufacturing steel containers. They're providing specialized engineering, regulatory expertise, transportation systems, radiation protection, environmental monitoring, cybersecurity, and decades of operational support. Governments and nuclear utilities don't hire the cheapest, but they hire the companies with the highest technical credibility and the strongest safety record. In this industry, one mistake can destroy decades of trust. That's why contracts are often measured in years or even decades instead of months. But if building and operating these facilities requires so much expertise, who are the companies that have turned this highly specialized work into multi-billion-dollar businesses? And how do they actually make money? Surprisingly, very few companies on Earth have the knowledge, certifications, and engineering capabilities required to operate in this industry. This isn't like opening a trucking company or building a warehouse. The customers are typically governments, nuclear utilities, and national energy agencies, and the contracts often last for decades. Companies such as Holtec International, Orano, Energy Solutions, BWX Technologies, and Westinghouse don't simply sell equipment, they provide complete nuclear life cycle services. That includes designing storage casks, transporting spent nuclear fuel, managing radioactive waste, supporting reactor operations, and helping decommission aging nuclear facilities. In many cases, the real product isn't a container or a machine. It's decades of engineering expertise and regulatory compliance that few competitors can match. What's fascinating is that the business model extends far beyond storage. Before a single shipment of nuclear waste can move, specialized transportation systems must be designed, licensed, tested, and approved. Every shipment follows strict security protocols and detailed safety procedures. Once the waste reaches its destination, companies continue earning revenue through inspection, maintenance, monitoring, security, engineering upgrades, environmental analysis, and long-term operational support. Some projects continue generating income for 20, 30, or even 40 years after the initial contract is signed. That's why many investors describe this industry as an infrastructure services business, not just a waste management business. The value doesn't come from one-time construction projects. It comes from long-term relationships supported by recurring government and utility spending. And that's what makes this industry so different from almost every other business we've covered on this channel. A landfill depends on garbage. A prison depends on government correctional contracts. A cemetery depends on long-term community demand. But a nuclear waste site depends on something even more powerful: trust. Governments cannot afford mistakes when dealing with radioactive material. One serious failure could have environmental, financial, and political consequences that last for decades. That's why proven companies with strong safety records often become the preferred partners for future projects. Their reputation becomes one of their most valuable assets. But if this industry offers such stable, long-term contracts and extremely high barriers to entry, why don't more investors talk about it the same way they talk about artificial intelligence, technology, or renewable energy? The answer has everything to do with risk and the unique challenges that come with one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world. Most investors are attracted to fast-growing industries like artificial intelligence or software because they can scale quickly. The nuclear waste business is the exact opposite. Growth is slow, projects take years to approve, and every decision passes through layers of scientific review, government oversight, and public scrutiny. But that's also what makes this industry so valuable. Once a company wins a major contract, it's extremely difficult for a competitor to replace it. Governments aren't looking for the cheapest provider. They're looking for the safest, most experienced, and most reliable partner. In this business, trust is a competitive advantage that can take decades to build, and only one mistake to destroy. That creates something investors love: high barriers to entry. Imagine trying to start a new nuclear waste company tomorrow. You would need world-class engineers, radiation experts, specialized manufacturing facilities, security clearances, transportation systems, environmental approvals, regulatory licenses, and years of proven operational experience. Even with unlimited money, earning the confidence of governments and nuclear utilities would take an enormous amount of time. That's why only a handful of companies compete in this space. Their expertise becomes their moat, protecting them from new competition, in much the same way that patents protect pharmaceutical companies or landing slots protect major airlines. In the world of investing, businesses with strong economic moats often command premium valuations because their competitive position is difficult to replicate. But perhaps the biggest advantage is something even simpler: time. Nuclear waste doesn't disappear after 5 years or even 50 years. It requires continuous monitoring, maintenance, engineering support, inspections, security, and regulatory compliance for decades. That means companies aren't just selling a product today. They're building relationships that can last a generation. Long-term service agreements create recurring revenue that's far more predictable than businesses dependent on changing consumer trends. That's why many analysts view the nuclear services industry as a form of critical national infrastructure rather than an ordinary industrial business. Yet despite those strengths, every opportunity comes with significant challenges. Because when your business involves radioactive material, the financial risks are only part of the story. The political, environmental, and public risks can be just as powerful. In fact, the greatest threat to a nuclear waste company isn't usually technology. It's public acceptance. Almost every community agrees that nuclear waste must be stored somewhere. But very few people want that place to be near their homes. This phenomenon has delayed or even stopped major nuclear waste projects around the world. A single change in government, a public referendum, or years of legal challenges can postpone a multi-billion-dollar project indefinitely. That's why companies operating in this industry don't just hire engineers. They also work with environmental scientists, legal experts, regulators, local communities, and government agencies to earn the public's confidence before construction even begins. Then there are the engineering risks. Every storage system must perform exactly as designed under conditions that most industries never have to consider. Extreme heat, flooding, earthquakes, corrosion, cyber threats, physical security, and long-term material degradation all have to be accounted for before a single storage cask is approved. Even after a facility becomes operational, continuous inspections, radiation monitoring, environmental testing, emergency preparedness, and security upgrades remain part of the daily operation. Unlike an ordinary warehouse, a nuclear waste facility can never afford to become complacent. One serious incident, even if it causes no injuries, could trigger years of investigations, regulatory action, financial losses, and damage to a company's reputation. In this business, reputation isn't just valuable. It's essential to survival. And that's exactly why many professional investors see this industry differently from almost every other sector. They don't evaluate it based on rapid growth or exciting new products. They evaluate it based on technical expertise, regulatory compliance, financial stability, contract quality, and decades of operational excellence. Companies that consistently demonstrate safety and reliability often become trusted partners for governments, creating relationships that can last for generations. That's an extraordinary competitive advantage. But it also comes with extraordinary responsibility. Which brings us to the final question. After everything you've learned today, if someone offered you the opportunity to own one of the world's leading nuclear waste companies, would you see a dangerous liability? Or one of the strongest infrastructure businesses ever built? Before you decide, there's one final lesson every entrepreneur and investor should remember. The biggest mistake people make when they hear the words nuclear waste is assuming the business is about radioactive material. It isn't. It's about solving one of society's most difficult infrastructure problems. Every industry creates a challenge that someone must solve. Airlines need airports. Internet companies need data centers. Hospitals need medical waste disposal. And nuclear power plants need safe, long-term waste management. The companies that succeed in this industry aren't selling danger, they're selling certainty. They're providing governments and utilities with the confidence that one of the world's most hazardous materials can be managed safely, securely, and responsibly for decades. That's why the value of these businesses isn't measured only in dollars. It's measured in trust. This also explains why the nuclear waste industry is often overlooked by everyday investors. It doesn't produce flashy consumer products. It doesn't launch a new smartphone every year. It doesn't dominate social media headlines like artificial intelligence or electric vehicles. Yet behind the scenes, it supports one of the world's most important energy sectors. Countries investing in nuclear power aren't just building reactors. They're committing to decades of storage, transportation, engineering, decommissioning, environmental monitoring, and regulatory compliance. Every one of those activities creates opportunities for specialized companies. In other words, the nuclear waste business isn't a one-time project. It's a long-term service industry built around recurring demand. And history has shown that businesses providing essential services often outlast businesses driven by short-term trends. So, would I personally invest in a nuclear waste company? My answer is the same as it has been throughout this series. I would never invest simply because an industry sounds profitable, or avoid it simply because it sounds dangerous. I would study the balance sheet, government contracts, debt levels, engineering capabilities, regulatory history, management quality, and long-term competitive advantages before making any decision. Because successful investing has never been about following emotions. It's about understanding businesses that most people ignore. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this entire industry. The companies that quietly solve society's hardest problems often become some of the most valuable businesses in the world. Which brings us to one final perspective that completely changes the way you'll think about nuclear waste and business itself. Most people see a nuclear waste site and think of danger. Scientists see decades of research. Engineers see one of the most complex infrastructure projects ever attempted. Governments see a matter of national energy security. But investors see something else entirely. They see long-term contracts, specialized expertise, extremely high barriers to entry, and an industry that society simply cannot ignore. That doesn't mean it's an easy business, and it certainly doesn't mean it's a business without controversy. It simply means that every major industry creates problems that someone must solve. And history has shown that the companies solving the hardest problems often build the strongest competitive advantages. The world may debate nuclear energy for years to come. But as long as nuclear power exists, the need to safely manage its waste will exist as well. So, you want to own a nuclear waste site. If your answer is yes simply because you heard it was a billion-dollar industry, then you've completely missed the lesson. But if your answer is yes because you now understand the value of engineering, government partnerships, regulatory expertise, long-term infrastructure, and trust, then you've discovered what makes this business so extraordinary. This industry doesn't generate wealth because radioactive material is valuable. It generates wealth because solving an essential problem is valuable. The companies that succeed aren't rewarded for storing waste. They're rewarded for providing confidence, safety, precision, and reliability in one of the most demanding industries on Earth. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson hidden behind every nuclear facility in the world. The greatest business opportunities are rarely the ones everyone wants to talk about. They're often the ones everyone else wants to avoid. That's exactly what we've seen throughout this series. Cemeteries don't sell death, they provide a lifelong service. Landfills don't sell garbage, they manage essential infrastructure. And nuclear waste sites don't sell radiation, they protect communities, support the nuclear energy industry, and solve a problem that cannot simply disappear. The next time you hear the words nuclear waste, don't think only about danger. Think about the engineers designing storage systems, the companies earning decades-long government contracts, the infrastructure protecting future generations, and the business models quietly operating behind the scenes. Because in the world of business, the most valuable companies aren't always the ones creating the future. Sometimes they're the ones protecting it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the world's most misunderstood industries, subscribe to Money Blueprint. We uncovered the hidden business models behind the companies, infrastructure, and industries that quietly power the global economy, so you don't just learn where money is made. You learn how money actually works.